Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Donna Maeda, Dean of the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship and Professor in American Studies. Welcome to the 2020 International Roundtable, Facing Pandemics of Disease and Race, Radically Reimagining for Liberatory Futures. Before we start the content of our program, here are just a couple of tech tips. This panel is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available on the International Roundtable page of the IGC's website. We welcome and thank Patty, who is our closed captioner today. To access the closed captioning, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitle. Instructions are also in the chat, which you can find at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen. We ask that you turn off your video by clicking on the Stop Video icon to minimize distractions for other viewers. All attendees' audio has been muted by the meeting co-host. And if you have any tech questions, please drop a note to tech in the chat. So you can click on the drop-down list on the chat and you'll find something that says tech support there. And if you chat that person behind the scenes, they will answer your questions. Later, there'll be a Q&A session and you can submit your questions in the chat under the tab, Submit Your Questions Here. Our intent is to be inclusive and welcoming of all attendees, and we ask you to approach this critical conversation with openness and respect for the speakers and other attendees. We do reserve the right to remove participants whose actions are not consistent with Macalester's community standards, which state in part, we do not tolerate anything defamatory or containing personal attacks or any form of harassment. And that's the end of the tech tips. Although we're zooming in from many places, this is an event of an educational institution on the land of the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota people. Although the college occupies the lands because of histories of forced removals and persistent settler colonialism, this is still Dakota land. The very legal concept of property is built on the violation of Indigenous sovereignty. As we celebrate the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings, we also acknowledge how much of our existence is built on continued violence and erasures of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. As we honor the strength and survival of Dakota ancestors, we're called on to move beyond the symbolic and to make accountability real by centering and building with descendants of those whose lands and labor provide foundations for our work in education. We also honor the lives and memories of those whose murders by agents of the state inspire the current movement for justice. George Floyd, Travis Jordan, Vernon May, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Brian Quinones, Bong Lee, and so many others. I invite you to take a moment to breathe and to reflect on these acknowledgements. Thank you. And now I turn the screen over to President Sue Rivera. President Rivera.
Thank you, Donna. Sorry for the delay, everyone. We just had a little technical difficulty. Hello, it is welcome to be with you today for this opening plenary session of the 27th Annual International Roundtable at Macalester College. The first Macalester International Roundtable was organized in 1994, and the theme of that inaugural roundtable was the international community and the emerging world disorder. At that roundtable, 4 invited scholars presented papers, and members of the Macalester community served as respondents. It was developed to provide opportunities for engaging multiple perspectives on issues of global importance. Today, the International Roundtable has grown into a community-wide and globally focused forum exploring critical issues from a variety of perspectives. It remains a unique tradition at Macalester, and I'm delighted to participate for the first time this year. This year's roundtable theme invites us to move from the deepened understandings of anti-Blackness and racism that emerged from the context of the global COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing protests about police violence and social inequality, to imagine and build a future that is more fair, more just, and more peaceful. After an intense week following a most unusual national election here in the US, it's especially important for us to make space to come together to talk about critical issues such as these as part of the process of building that future together. Although we know that even once the election result finally is decided and we move forward as a nation, there are still deep divides that need to be bridged, historical injustices that need to be corrected, and current ongoing pain that needs to be healed. I'll be thinking about those goals as I listen to today's plenary session and the other thought-provoking panels and sessions that will be presented as part of the roundtable over the next couple of days. Before I finish, I want to give some thanks to the DML for partnering with the Anon IGC for this international roundtable, and to the team of dedicated folks who planned this year's program. At a time where we all had so much extra work on our shoulders, I'm especially grateful for their efforts. They are Catherine Chang, Assistant Professor Geography, Ruth Ann Godoli Wallace, Professor Art and Art History, Olga Gonzalez, Associate Dean of the Anon IGC and Associate Professor of Anthropology, Ellen Holt, World Librarian and Archivist and in charge of Special Collections, Ruth Janish, Assistant Dean for Educational Partnerships, Anon IGC. Of course, Donna Maeda, who you've already heard from, Dean, Anon Institute for Global Citizenship, but also Professor of American Studies. Cedric McClure, Assistant Dean, Department of Multicultural Life. Khaldoun Saman, Professor of Sociology, and Marjorie Trueblood, Dean of Multicultural Life. I extend my gratitude to all of you for helping us think and imagine and dream. With that, I will turn it back to Donna so we can move on with the rest of the program. Donna?
Thank you so much for your words of welcome and for your framing, President Rivera. So today's IRT plenary panel is entitled State of Emergency or State of Opportunity, Tools and Practices for Self-Determination. The COVID-19 pandemic, cycles of police murders, protests, and repression, and a national leader who incites hate have created a sense of social destabilization associated with the state of emergency that has disrupted normal ways of living. Circulating in public discourse are attempts to understand disparities of race and class that shape health, policing, and political participation. But critical analysis of anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy shows how enslavement, genocidal practices, the stealing of indigenous lands and resources, and colonialisms are the foundations of a nation, its laws, governing structures, and ideological legitimation. The state of emergency also creates the opportunity to ask, what's worth saving? Today's panelists will consider what's made possible by the ruptures to the normal worlds and how, with radical care and mutual aid, we might build towards new worlds. So after I introduce today's panelists, each will extend those introductions to tell us the story of their relationship to these topics. I'll then invite the panelists to respond to what they hear from each other, and they'll move on into conversation from there. So today's panelists are Duaba Unenra, who is the Director of Neighborhood Engagement and Learning at Confluence Studio, located at the corner of Chicago and Lake in Minneapolis. Through art, community organizing, and scholarship, he looks at how forces of neoliberalism took advantage of openings created by environmental disasters in Haiti and New Orleans to reinforce anti-Black, anti-poor, anti-woman, and anti-queer living and ways of being. He engages in mutual aid and building counter sites as social tools for self-determination and healing in Black, Indigenous, Brown, and other communities, including in institutions of higher education. Quito Ziegler is a Macalester alum, class of 98, who has spent 20 years organizing community projects in New York City and Minneapolis, including working on community safety and accountability projects this past summer in Minneapolis's Powderhorn Park neighborhood. They are a professor of social movements at the School of Visual Arts in Brooklyn and have been a convener of Mutual Aid New York City since the onset of COVID. Marla Pérez Lugo is a Humphrey Distinguished Visiting Professor of Environmental Sociology in the Environmental Studies Department at Macalester. She's also a professor of social science at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and also a co-founder of Puerto Rico's National Institute for Energy and Island Sustainability, as well as the RISE Network, an inter-university collaborative that redefines the role of universities in disasters and recovery. And the fourth panelist is Cecilio Ortize García, who is a Humphrey Distinguished Visiting Professor of Energy and Governance in the Environmental Studies Department. He's also a professor of political science at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and he's a co-founder of the RISE Network. He explores the role of higher education institutions in local and national extreme operating environments. So thank you to all the panelists for being here, and Duaba, we'll start with you.
Okay. Can you hear me all right, Donna?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So thank you to everyone who is attending today. I'm not gonna start my video, in part because I like to be in the practice of controlling who can and can't see me, as a matter of personal protection, because we live in a time where repression of Black, Brown, and Indigenous thinkers, organizers, and people with a certain politic are repressed. So you won't see my face today. You'll just see this image that represents me. I also just want to add on to the acknowledgement that you did, Donna, and acknowledge that I am a descendant of stolen Africans, both people whose bodies, lives, spirits were stolen and who resisted that condition over the last anywhere from 300 to 500 years. I also want to acknowledge that I aim to be part of the generation that, in solidarity with Indigenous people, fights to have the lands that we reside upon, which have also been stolen, returned to them. And I hope to be part of the generation that sees the rebuke and escape from whiteness occur, and that we all become re-indigenized people on this planet rather than people of the colony and the plantation, which is what we're being made to be by some of the institutions that we're part of today. And I say that as a way of introducing myself. And Donna, you're gonna have to stop me when it's my time, because you know I like to talk. But I'm a child of New Orleans. My ancestors are people who were taken from Africa, enslaved in Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I also have Indigenous and European ancestry too. And so the vantage point that I speak to you from is that of someone who is Black and Creole. I'm a survivor of the Reconstruction effort that came after Hurricane Katrina. I am a survivor of a collective experience that Black folks who faced the Middle Passage endured, called the Ma'afa, the Great Tragedy. And these experiences came together to help me become, or teach me how to become, at first a community organizer, and later what I call myself a culture smith, someone who works with the cultures of resistance in order to solve and face the social problems that emerge in the present moment, but are also rooted in historic grievances and historic issues, and combats a politics that seeks to create a future where we remain enslaved in some way, either to debt or to systems that basically drain life and vitality from us as individuals, collectives, and communities. some of the things that I hope to speak about today, beyond the work that I've done in learning about my experience in New Orleans and the experience of kinfolk in Haiti, is also to speak to the conditions of mutual aid in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is where I've resided for the last few years. And hopefully in the conversation, I will be able to explore the ways that mutual aid as a framework is Eurocentric, and that what we call mutual aid work in one discourse is just the day-to-day work of survival that Black, Brown, Indigenous folks have practiced for centuries, not just to survive the current clash that we have with the colony and the plantation, but these are our cultural and political systems that we continue to rework and reside in and live through. Our culture is our life support system. And I would prefer to discuss what we call mutual aid in this discussion with the language of care work, not radical care work, but just care work. And so, yeah, beyond that, I'm also co-director at Confluence Studio. We're in East Lake, studio for community design. And one of the things that we do is foster the creation of social tools through the arts to create sort of political and creative gatherings for folks along the Lake Street corridor, particularly in the 9th Ward of Minneapolis, to come together and engage in a much different form of politics, a form of politics where we are working together to shape the future and the present that we want, a politics where we're figuring out how we want to live together in new ways using art and cultural tools. And that is also rooted in a politics of care work or mutual aid for some. Yeah, and I think that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Duaba. And Quito?
Hi, everyone. I'm Quito. I'm a fourth generation New York City Jew who came to Minnesota to go to Macalester in the mid-90s. So I'm a 98 graduate. And while I was there, after I graduated, I started working on Lake Street with a photographer I had met, Wing Young Huey, who photographs all of the people that live along Lake Street and who actually maintains a studio that is directly across the street from the murder site of George Floyd. But I spent about 4 years working on Lake Street and getting to know people there. Throughout my 20s, organized in South Minneapolis with immigrants and helped build a coalition of people to support the DREAM Act and other immigrant rights work in the early aughts. Eventually though, I went home because I'm a New Yorker. It's where my people are from. It's where I'm most comfortable. It's my home. And have lived through over the last decade as a kind of the realization in community of my own gender, which is non-binary, and sort of live through the growth and the expansion of the queer and trans, I guess you could call it a movement, but like a cultural movement, it feels like. And so over the last decade, I've engaged in a lot of queer and trans movement building, which basically means like either throwing a lot of parties or hosting a lot of events and holding space for queer folks. It means stewarding queer land projects out in the woods. It has meant engaging in learning a lot of the history from before Stonewall, but through the Stonewall era, through ACT UP, working alongside people from these different generations of queer life in New York City, building really deep relations to the legacy of Sylvia Rivera, working with young people in an emergency shelter called Sylvia's Place that she founded as her dying wish to take care of unhoused young people in New York City. And just a lot of conversations about what does interdependence mean in a community that has always been marginalized. How do we support each other? How do we do that with accountability? Working through a lot of the stuff that comes up in autonomous spaces and learning a lot. Also sort of, queerness is intersectional. New York City is a very, very, very diverse place. And so what does intersectionality actually mean? And how do you work through the conflicts that arise when people from various experiences who share a common identity try to do shit together? It's complicated. A lot of stuff comes up. So just living through the process of building and being in queer community over the last 10 or 15 years in New York. And kind of exploring like, what does it mean to try to end violence against Black trans women? How do you do that? That's not something that you can make a policy to make it stop. It's something that we have to fix within how we treat each other. And just the bigger questions ultimately led me to greater and greater solidarity with Indigenous folks, learning alongside Two-Spirit people about the histories of New York, or what we call New York State and New York City, and just thinking about like, what does decolonization actually mean in practice in a city as complex as New York City? When the COVID moment started, a lot of people arrived to this idea of mutual aid, which again was something that had been practiced in queer spaces for generations as marginalized people. So all of a sudden you have a lot of folks who are like, mutual aid, mutual aid. So a cluster of us started something called Mutual Aid New York City to try to organize. There were almost 100 new mutual aid projects that sprang up almost overnight when the pandemic hit us. And we have grown into an 80-person collective that is thinking a lot about self-governance and how we do that non-hierarchically. How do we learn from Indigenous folks about how governance works or has worked on our land before? And how that work can be done with accountability and just trying to cut through some of the bullshit that comes up, essentially. This summer I came back to Powderhorn though, because again, like I'm a professor, I have my summers free. I frequently come back to Minneapolis for the summer. I was an organizer here for most of my 20s, so I have a lot of friends and people. And one of them is a council member in Powderhorn who was overwhelmed by everything that was happening in the district and welcomed me back here to share whatever I could with people on the ground here about abolition, about transformative justice, about accountability. It involved a lot of listening to a lot of people this summer with a lot of different perspectives on what was happening between the George Floyd Autonomous Zone, the homeless encampments that landed in Powderhorn Park and then spread throughout the parks in Minneapolis, and is still an ongoing, it's snowing outside today and not everybody is housed yet, and there's people in hotels that are unstably housed. There's a lot of like still ongoing drama about how we keep each other safe over the winter as with unhoused people as part of our community. And yeah, just shared whatever I could and around transformative justice, accountability, and the cultural change that we experienced as trans and non-binary people over the last decade as sort of an indicator of like what collective transition could look like into something that is better or different than what we have now, accepting the reality of the failed state and thinking about how we do better at supporting each other through that, and how do you scale that up, and just a lot of questions of self-governance. So specifics will come out in stories as we start bouncing off each other. It's a real honor to be on this panel and to have had the lead up conversations with the other panelists. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say to start out. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Quito. And Marla?
Hi, everyone. My name is Marla Pérez Lugo, and thank you so much for the invitation and for letting me be part of this distinguished panel. I'm so honored. And when we started talking about this international roundtable, there were two concepts that came up repeatedly. Experience of oppression, experience of social inequality, and the experience of mutual aid. So I organized my introduction in using pictures that exemplify what are my experiences with symbolic neck, knees in my neck, basically, and the experience of mutual aid focusing on the most recent disaster in Puerto Rico, the impact of Hurricane Maria, category 4-5 hurricane that devastated the island completely. So if you allow me, I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States is a very complicated one, but there are some out there that says that we are the last colony because our U.S. citizenship is not worth the same in Puerto Rico than in the United States. In fact, this was my first time that I could vote on presidential elections, being a U.S. citizen. And the whole legal apparatus that mediates that relationship is based on the assumption that Puerto Ricans are inferior people and that they cannot govern themselves and they are incapable of creating democratic institutions for self-governance. Of course, that was met with a lot of resistance since 1898. That was the invasion of US to Puerto Rico. And another knee on my neck is the utilization of Puerto Rican territory for the purposes of the United States. And the example I brought here was the use of the island of Vieques for military testing. And this represents the fishermen of Vieques resisting the use of the US Navy of the beaches and the territory for exploding ammunition, basically. Of course, in 2017, Puerto Rico came into the spotlight because of the impact of Hurricane Maria and because of the treatment that the US government had in Puerto Rico to respond to such a disaster. And I chose this picture because it exemplifies the kind of treatment that the federal government had towards Puerto Rico. Here, President Trump is throwing paper towels at the people who are in a shelter without any food or any water or any permanent place to live. And basically FEMA and all the structures that were supposed to be present in the island to allow us a speedy recovery, adopted the same position. Of course, the media also presented that 2,945 people died because of the impact of Hurricane Maria and because of the lack of attention of the federal government to the circumstances on Puerto Rico. And I chose this picture because this was a manifestation, and silent manifestation, of the people that died. And the pairs of shoes of the victims were located in front of the Capitol to exemplify the extent of the genocidal attitude of the federal government towards Puerto Rico. Of course, mutual aid was a sign of resistance. It has always been since 1898, but in the case of the hurricane, sociology of disasters have always known that the first responders are your neighbors and the people around you. So communities organize immediately to respond to the needs of families and individuals. To provide basic needs like water, like medicine, like food. This is a collective, a community a kitchen that was organized in the town of Arecibo to feed the people who didn't have anything to eat. And afterwards, because of that sense of mutual aid, conversations among different sectors of the Puerto Rican society started organizing basically organically in the towns where they started visualizing or imagining alternative Puerto Rico in terms of how do we organize ourselves and how do we envision a sustainable and resilient Puerto Rico in the future. So, I'm going to leave it here that kinds of give us an overview of the point of view that I came from. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Thank you, Marla and Cecilio.
And colleagues of the panel and everyone that's joining us today on this snowy day in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is usually not Afro-Caribbean attire, but I guess I'm trying to weather the storm as we speak. I'm honored to be included in this conversation, and I just want to give you a perspective to that I hope can help enrich the conversation as we go. And that perspective is the perspective of the role of knowledge and the role of knowledge organization in processes of decolonization and processes of liberation. And one of the main aspects of our conversation today, which is to critically analyze the concept of mutual aid. And why knowledge organization? Well, for good or for bad, I decided to make a career in academia. So we have this perhaps professional deformation to think that we are living lives surrounded and engulfed and centered in knowledge, which I think could not be further from the truth. As academics, we have made a commitment in a profession of academia to point out, make it a point to point out ignorance. Ignorance not as the absence of knowledge, but ignorance as a manufactured tool of power asymmetry making, power asymmetry developing, and in fact, colonizing. And I come to you from this perspective, again, from an island perspective, the island of Puerto Rico. Marla has done a great job of contextualizing what that is. There are some words, though, that we should keep in mind as we engage in this conversation. Words and narratives that have made us who we are, and that have made our fights and our contestations and are an integral part of everything we do. I always keep these words in mind as a promise that was perhaps broken many times and might be about to be broken again. The words of General Miles when his troops landed in Puerto Rico in 1898. And these are the words that establish coloniality as a regime, and that establish the grasp that regime has on me today as I explore other worlds and I see and observe others, including my colleagues, which are also observers. And let me just read a little bit of that. We have not come here to make a war upon the people of a country that for centuries has been oppressed, but on the contrary, to bring you protection, not only to yourselves, but to your property, to promote your prosperity and bestow upon you the blessings of the liberal institutions of our government. It is not our purpose to interfere with any existing laws and customs that are wholesome and beneficial to your people, so long as they conform to the rules and military administration of order and justice. As I reflect in the period of transitions that the island of Puerto Rico has undergone from 1898 to 2020, I find myself as a traveler in the management of that transition under the rubric and under the regime of coloniality. That I think has allowed me to engage in deep reflection and deep observation of some of the dialectic processes that continue day to day to occur. Some of the presentations and representations of reality as I now look at an election inside the empire that reflects what is my normality back in the colony and has everybody really up in arms and in a state of shock and high uncertainty. Well, this is what I live with every 4 years. And I'm just hoping to be able to make a contribution in this conversation about how universities are doing in terms of knowledge organization, how we are doing in terms of how that knowledge organization lends itself or not to the concept of mutual aid. Does it happen? Is it allowed to happen? What are the forces that don't allow a decentralization of knowledge, decolonization of knowledge, and our universities themselves possible in an era of the Anthropocene where mutuality and collaboration in the face of multiple layered, extreme operating environments are what we're going to continue to face. So I'll leave it right there, and I'm really excited to engage in this conversation with my colleagues and all of you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, all of you. There is so much there that is just ready for conversation. So I'd like to invite any of you to respond to what you've heard from each other. And if we need, I have a question that I can sort of pop in, but I would like to invite you first.
Well, if you allow me, I would like to explore an alternative conceptualization of mutual aid, or an unintended consequence of mutual aid that we experience in Puerto Rico. And is that mutual aid usually is thought in terms of solidarity and in terms of help within a group. But we not often think about how does that mediate then the relationship between the marginalized group versus the structures that are imposing those marginalized conditions. And in the case of Puerto Rico, one of the problems was that communities responded so quickly and helped organize so quickly to help neighbors and to help people in need, that in one sense, a discourse of don't deal with the government, don't deal with those people, they are not useful, and let's focus on us and our relationship, provided for eximing or letting those structures to get away with not providing the conditions and the help and the assistance that they are supposed to be providing due to the very definition of what they do. And so by developing that discourse of intensity of mutual aid, we were letting them getting away with basically creating a parallel reality and that reinforced the very same conditions that the mutual aid was designed to address.
I can. You go ahead, Cecilio.
Go ahead. You're good.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna riff off of what Marla was sharing. I think there was a similar let's say schism between folks who are committed to doing mutual aid and more grassroots care work and political work, and the folks who were in institutions and positions of state power in both New Orleans and Haiti after Katrina and after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And yeah, it was a similar relief in some ways of, because folks were so busy providing for themselves, it gave in some ways the state forces permission to not work as hard, even though they came with the intent not to work in the first place for regular people. But yeah, it brings up a kind of conflict or tension between do we want the state forces that we've paid taxes to be accountable for helping us in situations of crisis? And then that's in tension with the reality that we know that they won't help us. And that's why we have a practice of collective care work and mutual aid in the first place. And so it's kind of a double bind that one has to navigate. And I'm not sure if it's something that we could really answer one way or the other either, but it is good to mark that as Marla is saying, in part because in some ways we legitimize the systems of power that we live in by consenting to them protecting us in times of crisis, right? But for a growing number of people in our society, more and more so as we hit 2040, 2050, and the darkening of this country anyway, it could be more and more the case that we are both investing in a system that doesn't care for us and can't care for us. And as we become more autonomous, we're also letting them off the hook, but we're still giving them resources that they should be using to support us. And so how do we kind of reverse that trend too? And what are the steps that one might take to reverse that trend is something I would throw out to the group.
I mean, it's the exact same thing that's coming up with the homeless encampments or the issues of unhoused people here in Minneapolis this summer, right? Like, what can mutual aid do? What do you ask the state for? What do you ask the state for when the state is not really proving themselves over generations to be able to actually meet the needs of unhoused people or to address it, partially because of all of the reasons why, but then also, like, what is the role of corporations and other sources of wealth and this comes back to mutual aid in a way, and building mutual aid networks that span different across class. And what does sharing across class look like? Something we're thinking about in New York is like, how do we go after the real estate industry? They have like 10 times more resources than the government does in terms of shelter. But like, can a mutual aid network be built all the way to people who are holding that kind of wealth and power, but outside of the state? Something that we, with Mutual Aid NYC and the housing work that we're doing, we specifically said, we are not here to do anything that's about asking the government for anything, because like, they're not, like, I've never spoken to a single unhoused person who's had a good experience with the shelter system, like zero. So what is the point of asking for that? And yet, Marla, I really hear what you're saying. Like, are we letting them off the hook when we are giving them our tax dollars? There's also like that, like an unlearning, I think, amongst many people who think that their tax dollars are paying for things like this, and they're paying for that, and it's just like not really functional. And so breaking through that idea that if we pay taxes, then all of these social problems are going to get taken care of by someone else who's not us. And it like removes the responsibility from us. So I tried to really maintain a focus this year on like, what can we do for ourselves? And like, you know, maybe we'll ask the government to foot the bill, but I don't expect them to come up with solutions, because I don't see them as the source of anything effective. When so much of what is wrong is like the way our social fiber has been really tattered.
I think we, and this is exemplary of the juiciness of our previous conversations before today. We've hit some sort of a node here of interconnection, because first of all, the image that Marla showed in her presentation, which is a cartoon depiction from 1898. For those of you history buffs, that picture was one of 5 pictures that were run in the Minneapolis Journal. Look at the interconnections that almost immediately begin to appear in our in this dialogue. This was drawn by a cartoonist named Charles Louis Bartholomew. I guess he was known as Bart at that time, and he was putting focus on, through the art of a representation, how art represented the type of relationships that were being seen by the American public in a Midwestern city. And you know, the characterizations of that juvenile dependency and the concentration of knowledge on one side and total dependency on the other side. Look at what we're talking in 2021. We're still hanging today to that period. However, I would argue that we can't forget, epistemologically, we're looking at things now more and more through whether we want it or not, through a neoliberal lens that really makes these bifurcations in the analysis of community resilience and how resilient should I be. And that's playing into policy, for example, with FEMA, as they interact with Puerto Rico with their policy of individual resilience. So it's not only that communities see themselves forced to realize this critique of representation of government on their well-being, their health and well-being, and taking things in their hands in terms of individual resilience. The system is adapting to and actually acting upon that narrative to create policy structures of individual resilience. So now it's codified in the public administration of disasters in the country, which makes for really, really interesting conflicts there, especially, and using the example again of the election. Right now, we are within days, I would say, of the possibility that we might be sustaining a current administration in the face of what constitutionally should be an incoming new administration. Okay, but we might be sustaining both for a while. How do we critically accept that kind of double standard? How can we accept that kind of challenge to the Constitution, especially from the standpoint of minority populations and vulnerable populations? If we do agree that there's already a double standard, it could get worse. And so I think that this argument of double taxation versus, not really versus, but vis-a-vis the argument of individual resilience is something to keep in mind as and track as the saga of the 2020 election keeps on moving forward. Because of this dialectic that neoliberalism brings in terms of resilience, it brings it to communities right in their face. Look, you're going to have to learn to govern your uncertainty on your own. And so that governance of uncertainty becomes the question for the health and well-being of communities, not necessarily what kind of acumen, governmental or non-governmental or multi-sectorial exists out there, but how I can govern as a community, as a minority community, as a Hispanic serving institution, as a historically Black serving institution, and how do I govern that uncertainty? So little by little, the questions of how we redesign our governance in society becomes an issue.
Man, can I jump in? Because there's a couple of things, Cecilio, that you said that really got my brain going. I think first, maybe it would be useful for folks who are listening in if we talked or made like a collective definition or description of what neoliberalism is. And I think what I've come to understand neoliberalism is through my studies of and learning from my experiences in New Orleans is that the way neoliberalism functions and comes to be is that there's basically the way the system perpetuates itself is not linear. There is no like straightforward path to secession between generations of people who hold power in this colonial system, this colonial nation that we live in. You have different factions of economic and political elites that fight for control over the governing structures of our country. And folks who are at the point of the spear, at the vanguard of neoliberal practice, are an emergent generation of American and global political elites that from their vantage point in the private sector and through forming conspiracies and vetting candidates inside of the government structure have privatized government structure. And part of the way that neoliberalism perpetuates itself, at least from what I've seen in New Orleans and Haiti, is that neoliberalism needs systems of social welfare and care to persist in order for it to make a profit. And so even as neoliberals are privatizing one aspect of the care system or the social welfare system that's been created by a government, they also need people to be engaged in more radical and imaginative forms of care work so that they can have the next set of infrastructure to take over. And so this is in part why working with nonprofits as a radical organizer is dangerous, because ultimately they're going to privatize this caring infrastructure that you set up and then resell it to somebody else down the line. So we're basically in the state of neglect that we face as Black, Brown, Indigenous, marginalized folks creating our own systems of care. We're also inventing new technologies of social welfare that can be stolen or bought from us and then incorporated into the neoliberal political infrastructure that's being set up. And I say that too, in part, just to maybe suggest that, neoliberalism is not the end all be all. Neoliberalism is one of many factions of power that is brewing in our current context. And there are others on the fringe too that we have to look out for moving forward. And the other part of what you were saying, the individualization of resilience and the governance of uncertainty. I think there's the best definition of racism that I've heard was from an elder who was saying racism is when you have to pay taxes or you have to pay tribute to a state that doesn't invest them back into you. It's a double taxation, a taxation without representation on the basis of how the state recognizes your humanity. And again, more and more people in our society, maybe there's a broader split between people who have been incorporated and enfranchised by the colony and those who haven't. And for those who haven't, the governance of uncertainty is kind of what you're doomed to. And that's a place of possibility and autonomy, but also precarity and danger. And again, considering that neoliberalism is kind of vampiric and it's seeking to steal technology that's been created by marginalized peoples, fugitive peoples, indigenous peoples, and bring that back into this colony that's falling apart. Part of the precarity of being ungoverned or being left to your own devices in a state of crisis is that this current regime of power is going to come and raid you and take the things that you've made to survive in its shadow. And so one thing to consider too is how do we protect these cultural movements that we made? Like Quito was saying, how do we disguise, or how do we protect the technologies that we're making to survive? And also, how do we get some form of accountability, or at least get the tax money that's been vamped off of us back so that we can put it to where we need it to go, as folks who have been both doomed and blessed to care for ourselves in these conditions. So that was a lot. Sorry, that's how I get when I'm around y'all.
Is this a Zoom silence moment?
I can say 100 things right now, but I don't know if it's coherent. Just like, how has the pandemic changed networks of care? How are people taking care of each other? What does it mean? What is our theory of change here? Like, what is the theory of change? How do we get out of this mess, right? Like, okay, neoliberalism rules in all of these ways, but like, we're agents of it in our own ways. Like, we're in it. It's not a choice to be complicit when your means of survival is rooted in these capitalist structures, right? And I don't know, I have this like recurring thought that I just want to say, which is like, somebody, I think maybe it was Marla, someone mentioned the Constitution. So the Constitution itself, when they were writing it and when they were framing, when the founding the founding bros were like framing our government, they consulted with the local indigenous people to New York State, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee is what they prefer to be called. And they had something called the Great Law of Peace, which was the oldest living participatory democracy in the world, right? It's like, it's a governance system that is non-hierarchical and that is, there's just a lot of beauty in it. Like but what I want to say is they messed with it, right? And the founders of these colonies here had the opportunity to respect a system that was already functioning here. And they switched it up because they wanted private property. They wanted to own land. They wanted to abuse land in ways that indigenous people were not comfortable with. And so they, imposed a system of ownership on the resources that came out of the land, or say, and how do we flip that back? Like, how do we reclaim land, or the resources or our labor from it? Because according to the Great Law, like, all of our labor is meant to be shared, and like the things that come out of the earth are meant to be shared. And yet somehow all of us participate in this system. It's like imposed, but what does the reclamation of that look like? And just all of the like ills of private property and like what that has done to us, and like what it's done to like our sense of collectivity and care. But then I also like just see a lot happening during COVID era that seems kind of interesting to me. Like people staying home more, caring for each other more, like rebuilding bonds with like in tight ways, being more connected to a place because you have to be in place. We're locked down in place right now. So what does that mean for people like rebuilding a relationship with the spot that they live on? Is that part of the key that's going to help us get to the next place? I don't know. Don't know if that was coherent, but.
No, that was very coherent.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Cecilia.
I think that COVID, I mean, all of these extreme events, whether it is the bankruptcy of a fiscal system of a state or a territory, or an earthquake, or a hurricane, or a pandemic, or all of these really unmask everlasting, ongoing, processes where power is just asymmetrically distributed on the basis of race, gender, and all sorts of things. So the one question that I've been asking myself for the last 3 years is my community, where can my community intervene, or is there an intervention role for my community? And I'm talking about the academic community. I mean, we as universities, we are geographically located in the middle of these landscapes of conflict, in the middle of these landscapes of so-called disasters. So if we follow the strict definition of environmental sociologists and disaster sociology, we are an integral part of the processes that are underlying that event. And when I look back at my university, the University of Puerto Rico, and the role that it was playing before Maria, I must say, it was like if we were just putting more logs under the fire for a disaster to happen. And as I traveled to other universities and trying to engage with colleagues in different universities to try to not find consensus, because we're not going to find consensus, but at least develop some common language and perhaps a vision of how those interventions should be in the future, I see I see a bunch of conflicts going on inside these institutions. Should I be local? Should I be global? Should I be STEM oriented? Should I be liberal arts oriented? Should I, all of these questions, which are tearing universities apart. And now in the face of COVID, we have seen that because those questions being unanswered, when it comes time for us to face together these events, what we see is disarray. What we see is not really community coming together. What we see is, well, I gotta look out for my own constituency, and I gotta look out for what type of university I'm at. So what I guess the point you're bringing, Quito, is absolutely crucial. Whether it is the pandemic or whether it is the unthinkable condition of a decaying institution inside an empire that brings about civil war. The question is, as a community, and as a community that wants to govern their uncertainty, what are we doing? What are we doing to better understand the other? What are we doing to better understand the other in conditions of decolonization? Not repeating the same colonizing languages of the past. And that does, I'm telling you, that question really keeps me awake at night. I'm not a good sleeper anyway, but it really doesn't help.
In fact, institutions of higher education have been replicating the same extractive relationships with communities. For example, with all this aura of STEM, as you mentioned, the biggest measure of success for a student that is comes from an underserved community is their capacity to live. So through education, we are extracting students and we are extracting minds that could contribute to the betterment of that community. And that is in terms of students, but also how we frame knowledge and how we frame the way we understand reality. We go to communities and we extract data, we extract knowledge, and then we reconfigure it and we publish it like if it was our own. And we don't give anything back to that community that produced the knowledge in the first place. So the role of institutions of higher education, I think, is key in this conversation, because we have the potential to be agents of change. We are repositories, big repositories of an important kind of knowledge that could help us develop new relationships and to question, to challenge those power structures that makes us vulnerable in the first place. But we are not. So the question is why we are not, and how could we really adopt that role?
I really hate to break in here. Once your conversation gets going, it's always so amazing. It's hard to break in. But I would like to move it to open it up to questions from the audience. And the reason I wanted to break in right now is that there's actually a question from the audience that touches on this. And so as you're looking at all the dynamics that you've been talking about exist within academic institutions and within higher education in general. And so there's that critique, but someone from the audience asked, in an interconnected world, moving more to, so then what could we do? How do you see institutions of education, so thinking pedagogically, curricularly, or through governance on institutions, and Marla, as you're saying, in relationships to communities, what might be a better way of thinking about the relationships to make a sustainable path through what seems to be a consistently contentious space of change, both within academic institutions and in the relationship to communities beyond?
Can I take this one? Or just to start it off? Because I think Quito has the answer to this question for sure, but I just want to frame things up before I pass it to Quito. Um, let's question what we mean when we say institution, because a university campus is basically just a giant like library housing project with a shared kitchen, really, right? And we could use a university campus in that way if we so chose. And so the institution itself is not the furniture and the buildings. The institution is the social agreement that we enter into about how we're going to use space and the tools available to us. And I'm saying that because in some ways an institution is just a polite name for what is better called a culture or a cultural movement. And the cultural movement that we participate in within the Western university system is colonization. As a university student, you are socialized to be an agent of colonialism. One of the things that I look at in my research on disaster management and the education of disaster managers is the ways in which the Eurocentric and technocratic framing of approaches to disaster mitigation are so reinforcing of colonial structures that it often makes conditions worse for Black and Indigenous people on the other side of a disaster than they were before. And it's in part because disaster managers are socialized to take advantage of the disruption that's caused by an ecological or a social catastrophe and use it to reinforce the power of the state. It's used to reinforce the cultural hegemony and political structures that make the state possible. But again, these are all just social agreements that we've entered into or that we consent to or that we're coerced into. And so the reason why I say Quito has the answer is because at the beginning of this conversation, Quito talked about being a steward and participant in cultural movements and systems of care work. And in some ways, we are afraid to resist the current institutions that the current social agreements within the university, because this is where we get our care. If the university did not provide some kind of care for me as a student, I would basically be living on the street. And that would be a major distraction from what I'm trying to do, from the intellectual project that I came to pursue. I could do it if I needed to, but I don't really want to, right? And so in some ways, and then I'm gonna shut up after this. If we can figure out how to steward our own cultural movements, then the institutions that govern university campuses become irrelevant. The only way the university institutions get power is from people entering into that social agreement with them. If we're going to play the game of letting universities legitimize us and network us and feed us, then it's a game where you're always going to be dependent upon a force that is consciously and unconsciously setting you up to harm the people that sent you to it. And so it kind of gives you it should give us an incentive to learn how to care for ourselves and start our own cultural movements. And so I'll pass it on now, but just wanted to frame that up.
Yeah, I think, okay, so having lived through the cultural shift around gender in the last 10 years and having come to my understanding of my own gender in like tiny queer spaces where like, it was okay to not be a boy and not be a girl and to like have that kind of ambiguity and to sort of land on a truth in that, that there was a truth about who I was that I'd never known. And to start articulating that in other spaces, like outside of our small queer community spaces, to be able to say outside of that, like, no, I use they and them pronouns because that's what works for me. And if you can, like, you need to respect that. And that idea, right? Because of the networks built of social media and whatever, the idea and the truth of the fact of that as a gender and that as a complication to, common understandings of gender, it was an idea. but it spread because there was truth to it. And I think that there's an idea and an understanding now that like the structures around us are not working, that like capitalism is a problem, but we have to figure out what to do about it. There's a truth to it. And how does that spread? Like in a lot of ways, like what I have imagined about how like the undoing of these systems is going to work. You know, Audre Lorde says the master tools, you can never use the master's tools to, I can't get the quote right. The master tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? We need different tools in order to do it. We are all here because we understand that some of those tools are community care and interdependence and self-governance, that those are the tools that are going to get us to the next place. What I know about transition is that like, they're not going to change the law in order to let us do this thing. Like we have to shift ourselves. You know, Cecilio mentioned the like civil war, right? It's a thing that people are talking about. Like, is that a thing? Are we already in it? What does that even mean? And I think that it's a war of ideas about how we deal and handle with the mess around us. And I think that it's a cultural war that is already being waged about how we feel about each other, how we care for each other, and what the best ways through all of this are. And I think that, you know, what I love, although it's complicated in this like mutual aid moment that we've been having this year, where like things that people in some communities have been doing for a long time are like becoming more, other people or people with more privilege are becoming more aware of that. And sort of breaking out of the like a colonialist mindset to a care mindset, which is the cultural shift, right? That I think is going to get us out of this. And it has to work. It has to be functional. I think there's a lot of dysfunctional attempts. I think that there's a lot that people learn by doing. And what I know about transition, you know, is that it starts off really hard and complicated, and all of the gross shit comes out that you've been repressing about, you know, that you haven't been talking about yourself or about, you know, how you fit into a greater world perspective. And your mind has to shift. But then there's also a lot of structural stuff, you know, like with gender transition, you got to go to the doctors, you got to line up the health insurance, you got to make your care plan for when you get your surgeries. Like there's work of it. And I think these things are both like kind of what we're in right now. And I know with gender transition, you do get to the end of it where you're like, hi, I'm living my fabulous non-binary life and no one can fuck with me. Like there's a way that you get to that place. And it starts off kind of like ugly and gross right now, but it's a shift. And that shift is cultural. And, you know, with the question of universities, it's not really a world that I hang out in too much, but I always sort of wonder, like, why are they not collective? Like, why is there like any instance of hierarchy that is out there is like kind of not the right thing for the future, at least in my theory of change. And so like, there's like basic things, or, you know, the extraction of knowledge from communities, and then you create intellectual communities, and how does it filter back into the communities where people are from? I don't know. Anyway, check.
It's really not looking good for universities in the face of the socio-political developments that we see day to day. I often joke around with this being like the end of persuasion, and I mean it in terms of one of political science's four major forms of power. No, you know, there's force, there's persuasion, there's manipulation, and there's exchange. And we certainly got really good at the exchange, on the exchange part, through markets and all of these market regimes. And certainly there's been the narrative, the democratic narrative of persuasion and democracy as the best decision-making process to be able to deliver in some outcomes for society's good. But it seems to me like with the enormous power of media and media technologies and the capture of a lot of these major corporations of the narrative and dialogue that includes the political narrative and dialogue. And now, as Cambridge Analytica says, I don't even need to lie. I just need to plant the seed of untrust, or of uncertainty. We right now, as universities, we have organized ourselves as organized anarchies, actually, where you have places where disciplines don't even talk to each other for extended periods of time. And then we come together for like an hour event, and then we go away, we never talk again. So that those things organizationally need to change. Who do we serve also needs to be rewritten and re-explored, because it can't be for us to be sustainable that if I exist in Minneapolis alongside other institutions or other organizations or other universities, that there are blind spots to the Twin Cities. That is unfathomable in terms of our resiliency, in terms of our communities' health and well-being, with the kind of knowledge power existent, for example, in the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities should not have any blind spots in the face of a stressor. And consequently, the Twin Cities region shouldn't have to be going anywhere to get the necessary acumen to engage in a transition. And that, in theory, it should be that way. But what is happening? What is happening is that we're putting out STEM students as a policy, for educational policy for the country. We extract those human resources from their neighborhoods. We develop science, technology, engineering, and math human members of this technological labor force, which we send back not to where they came from to make a contribution, but they're actually globally looking at where they insert themselves individually to develop individual resilience. So does it bring you back to the old neoliberal adage? Maybe. So how do we do that? How do we begin to change that? And I hear what the colleagues have said, and how hard it's going to be for institutions of higher education to detach themselves from the regime they themselves are helping to create. Understood. I guess I'm sort of an optimist in terms of being able to bring these institutions to a collective convergence dialogue that is not run by them, where they could become a space for the dialogue, but it's not run by the university. It's run by those communities, by those sectors, by those populations that are looking at those institutions in their neighborhoods and are saying, what are you doing here? What exactly happens behind those walls? What are those kids doing in there? I mean, and those questions are being asked today of universities all around the world. And what connection do I have to that? So anyway.
I would like to, so there are a couple of questions that touch on this pretty directly or follow from what you've been saying. And kind of getting back to what Quito said before, like we have agency in this. And the other question was like, who's the institution? So there are two questions that kind of come together in this, following what Cecilio just left us with. So from within an institution, or those of us who work within an educational institution, how can we think of, the general question between these is, how can we think of what we do, given what you've all been saying about how these have become spaces not to do this? So one is, how can education, beyond its economic value, in the ways that people are being brought in for that, how can education help shape or reshape how we approach mutual aid in terms of changing our material and objective reality? And the second question that is a little bit, brings a little bit more concreteness, especially with Cecilio's last point, thinking about the epistemic and practical implications of the current moment and the necessity of community care work. How do we weave together the formal and informal structures we are creating to bring in folks currently left out and make sure people don't get left behind? So with what Cecilio was saying, outside of the institution, what's our relationship, and how do we, as those inside, how might we think about education in relationship to those dynamics?
Can I jump in? If nobody
And
else
just to
wants
let
to.
you know, we're going to have to, this will be the last question. We'll have to keep it a little bit short. It's about 4 minutes to 1, but go ahead, Duaba.
Stop constructing the argument around formal and informal, because it looks down and it spits upon the work that communities outside of the boundaries of the university actually do on a day-to-day basis and have done for a much longer period of time, with less material resources in the university to survive. And maybe a better dichotomy to think about this would be, functional, dysfunctional. And if you frame it that way, then the dysfunctions that occur within the university, which are vast, and the dysfunctions that occur within publics and communities also, and the functionalities of both, we can talk about those more honestly, because we can't assume just because you wear a suit or a button-up shirt to work that your institution has its shit together, because it doesn't. That's the reason why we're having the conversation in the first place. So I just want to bring that up to caution folks. Universities cannot save the world. Universities are not going to save poor people or Black and brown people. We got that. We've been doing that. And instead, maybe the question is, to what Cecilio was saying earlier, where in the power structure can you intervene? That you play a role in socializing people to be colonists. Can you start to play a role in socializing people to be indigenous again? Because you have all the books, the universities have all the stolen relics, the universities have the tax dollars that we pay in, and to put our money, our resources, and our ancestors' knowledge towards a deepening of the colonial system is an act of violence that could easily be remedied if people just literally just decided to do something much different.
Wow.
I think that, does somebody else have a quick comment that, or we might use that as, okay, go ahead, Quito.
Just a quick one. Always ask who's not at the table. Who is not sitting around the table with you? Why and why not? Especially when you're talking about knowledge and knowledge production and knowledge sharing, who's not there and why? And how do you become more inclusive of that? And how does that shift the work of education and knowledge sharing by broadening that?
And who's not at the table, and the question why, and what can we do about that? Yep. So I think we'll need to close it there. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm really sorry for all the people who asked questions that we were not able to get at. We are fortunate that 3 of the panelists have a direct connection to Macalester, and I think that there are opportunities to continue this conversation. And I also know that Duaba is interested in maintaining a connection in the conversations that we're having. So thank you to all of you for the really rich conversation, not only today, but all of the conversations leading up to this day. Before we close out, I'd also like to extend gratitude to everybody who made the session possible. While I can't name everybody individually, I do want to give special thanks to the IRT Planning Committee, who President Rivera named, Professor Ruth Ann Godelli for her dual role on the committee and the art session she's doing tomorrow, Professor John Kim, who connected us with both Quito and Duaba, Leila Pierce, 08, for her image to represent the roundtable, Kevin Ward, Marina Ito, communications and marketing, information technology services, especially Jean Binfa, who's helping behind the scenes today, the staff of the Department of Multicultural Life, and the staff of the Annan Institute for Global Citizenship, particularly Meg Thorson, Matt Katsaris, Ruth Yanish, Rachel Weeks, and Zinnia Schwartz, who have been working really hard behind the scenes to make this all possible. Thank you all for joining you, and I hope that you have a good afternoon.